We greatly appreciate everybody participating this afternoon. Thanks for dedicating your time to this. Just a few house rules before we start. Upon entering the Zoom room, please keep your microphone on mute at all times. If you do have any questions for our speakers, we will use the chat function. So at all times, please keep your microphone on mute. And also, if you're interested in joining ForceNet, we do have links at the bottom for everybody to look at, and you can log in later and actually join ForceNet. It's free, and we will keep you involved with all of the different procedures that we've got going on. All right, so you may be wondering, what is ForceNet? Well, ForceNet is an NIH-funded U-24, and we actually have three primary objectives. The first objective is to create a network of force-based mechanisms researchers. So in other words, to get people such as those that are watching this presentation all in one room to work together. The second is to improve our understanding of force-based mechanisms through dissemination and training efforts. And the third is to fund force-based mechanisms research through pilot grants. There are 5 investigators associated with ForceNet, and we'll introduce ourselves now. I'm Chad Cook. I am from Duke University. I'm a professor there. I have appointments in the Department of Orthopedics and Population Health Sciences and the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Dr. Reed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Bill Reed. I'm the Director of Rehab Sciences at University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'm MPI of this project along with Dr. Cook. And basically my background is in manual mechanisms of manual therapy using animal models.
All right, and Dr. Elliott?
Hi, I'm Dawn Elliott. I'm a biomedical engineering faculty at the University of Delaware. I study mechanical forces in orthopedic tissues like disc, meniscus, and tendon.
Dr. Napadow?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure. My name is Vitaly Napadow. I'm the Director of Pain Research at Spalding Rehab Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and I'm a neuroimager focused on brain activity in chronic pain patients and their response to non-pharmacological therapies, including manual therapies.
Dr. Kalchuk?
Hi, everyone. It's Greg Kawchuk. I'm a co-investigator on ForceNet and very excited to have you here today. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine in the Department of Physical Therapy with a clinical background in chiropractic. And I've been looking at low back pain related issues on a force-based level, all the way from molecular genetic level investigations to clinical and policy investigations.
Terrific. All right. So let me give you the parameters of this afternoon's agenda. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Alex Tuttle, who is, and he'll be speaking about NCCIH program priorities. Then we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. John Burns, who will be talking about mechanisms.
I'd like to start fellowship.
Let's go ahead and mute, please. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Let's remain muted. Dr. John Burns will be talking about mechanisms, a critical yet still understudied component of treatment, development, testing, and implementation. We'll provide a short period of time for Q&A in the chat bar if you have any questions for Dr. Tuttle and Dr. Burns. Then ForceNet's own Dr. Kalchuk will talk about training initiatives and collaborative opportunities at ForceNet. And then ForceNet's Bill Reed, Dr. Bill Reed, will talk about our current pilot funding that we have presently at ForceNet. We'll give a little time for Q&A at that point through the chat function, and then I'll close us off with some contact information. Our goal is to get you all out of here within around an hour, but to also receive a lot of great information. All right, our first speaker is Dr. Alex Tuttle. Dr. Tuttle is a program director in the Basic and Mechanistic Research Branch of the National Center of Complementary and Integrative Health, where he manages the manual therapies and basic pain research portfolios. Dr. Tuttle also oversees several programs in the HEAL initiative, including the myofascial biomarker program, as well as the HEAL analyst think tank. Dr. Tuttle received his PhD in experimental psychology from McGill and previously served as a health program specialist and acting chief of staff in the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke prior to joining NCCIH. And Dr. Tuttle is the program officer of RU24. Dr. Tuttle, I'll stop sharing the screen and you are welcome to share yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Chad. I appreciate the introduction. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have very little time and I want to cover a fair amount of ground. So this is our NCCIH's network program priorities for the force-based manipulation U24 program. So these networks were funded on an RFA that's based on the neurocircuitry of force-based manipulations workshop that we ran back in 2019 in collaboration with NICHD, NCMRR, NINDS, NIA, and NIBIB. The purpose of the workshop was to identify research opportunities that bring neuroscientists, clinicians, physiologists, and engineers together to advance the cutting-edge research related to force-based manipulations. As well, the workshop was intended to foster interdisciplinary collaborations and work towards common language and terminology, and monitor the state of the field and reduce identified gaps in knowledge. So based on the feedback from that workshop, there was a preliminary research framework proposed that looked at integration between tissues and the nervous system. And so, the idea is that practitioners can either influence the afferent pathway that starts in the periphery and then goes up to the central nervous system, or to engage in manipulations, force-based manipulations, non-force-based manipulations that influence social context, psychological factors, for example, that can then go through efferent pathways and influence the peripheral nervous system and the juncture between muscles and nerves. So the point of this workshop was to identify the best way forward to fund research to better understand this framework and develop this framework. The U24 RFA was published last year. I want to give thanks to Dr. Leslie Osborne, who is on the call today from NINDS, who's one of our subject matter experts, as well as and Dr. Osborne is in the Systems and Cognitive Neuroscience cluster at NINDS, as well as my branch chief, Dr. Wen Chen, who's also serving as a subject matter expert on these networks. And so the primary scientific goals of the RFA is to advance research on the study of neural mechanisms of biomechanics of force-based manipulations. There's 5 key scientific program priorities that were enumerated in the RFA. One is terminology and measurement of force-based manipulations. There's also development of mechanistic multi-scale research that measures physiological responses, as well as understanding contextual effects of force-based manipulations. So this is the efferent pathway that I described a moment ago. We also were calling for biomarkers of force-based manipulation, development of biomarkers of force-based manipulations, as well as development of technology and methodological tools to further our understanding and employ them in mechanistic studies to understand force-based manipulations. So that's the scientific priorities. The activities of the force-based manipulations were enumerated by Chad in ForceNet's priorities, but just to quickly go through it again, the RFA called for the U24 networks to develop meetings, workshops, conferences, collaborations as ways to build collaborations across different disciplines, a multidisciplinary approach to understanding force-based manipulations. As well, each of the 3 networks that ended up being funded are given funds to give awards to pilot research projects. And so these are small $50,000 awards that can be used to generate preliminary data and help investigators compete for more substantial NIH grants through existing PARs, other funding opportunities available at the NIH. And so the idea is to seed the ground here and then reap the benefits by having investigators of these pilot awards come in for additional funding. Finally, dissemination and outreach is an important part of these networks' priorities. And so a lot of effort you'll see on behalf of these 3 networks is to develop different ways to disseminate, to reach out to the public, to publish and provide multimedia support of findings and sort of collaborations across these disciplines. So I just wanted to end by sharing that there is an organization among the three networks. Each network is working independently to achieve these scientific priorities. But as well, we have a steering committee structure where these three networks are working together to further those three the three main goals of dissemination / outreach, collaboration, and then making sure that pilot awards are coming in to the appropriate mechanism. So I want to thank all of our partners, both within the networks as well as at the NIH, that has sort of made this structure possible. We have more big things planned for the coming year, including the first annual PI meeting. We would like to also have discussions about adding additional working groups. Those are over to the right side, but I'm already very impressed with the dissemination and pilot awards working groups and their report to the steering committee. And thank you to Bill and Ellen from the Neurons Matter Research Network for agreeing to be chairs for the first year. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have after our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And if you don't mind, stop sharing your screen. We'll ask Dr. Burns to share his.
Okay.
Wonderful. And that gives me an opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Dr. John Burns. Dr. Burns is a professor and vice chair of research in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and also a professor in the Department of Anesthesiology, both at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Burns received his PhD in clinical psychology from State University of New York at Stony Brook in 1992. His research is focused on understanding psychosocial aspects of chronic pain, and the work is currently and previously funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. His work has used a variety of methodologies, including observational, experimental, daily diary, and clinical trial designs to explore both mechanisms and clinical outcomes. And if you don't mind, I'd like to give you some perspective of one of his trials or studies that he's performed to study anger regulation and pain. He used a standardized lab method to invoke anger in patients, and he followed this with pain induction. And for today's keynote address, Dr. Burns will discuss the use of open trial and randomized controlled trial methods to concurrently examine outcomes, mechanisms, and moderators of psychosocial interventions for chronic pain. He's a terrific advocate for mechanisms research, and on behalf of the ForceNET team, Dr. Burns, we're so pleased to have you present. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. We'll get started. Yeah, trying to get rid of the top part of that screen. You see the band across the top, or is that I'm the only one who sees that?
No, it looks good. It looks okay.
Okay, great. Okay. So the overarching goals of all of our work in trying to come up with new treatments for health ailments is to see whether or not any of our treatments are related to, or really what we really want to know is whether that they cause these outcomes. Does it work is still and will remain forever a compelling and critical question to ask and address. There's loads of efficacy studies on treatments of chronic pain, psychosocial force-based manipulation, which would be called FBM, yoga, physical therapy, exercise, and loads of other ones, all evaluated to varying degrees for efficacy, usually compared to treatment as usual or some other minimal control. And the conclusion I think we can all agree on is that all of them seem to work to some degree in producing favorable outcomes. And all, and I think this is really important to all of us, offer alternatives or adjuncts to any kind of biomedical interventions. Now, comparison studies, however, is where we compare active treatments, not just comparing active treatment to a control. And we find something a little more intriguing, I think. So within kinds of treatment approaches, and this is a term I invented just for this, where we have, say, psychosocial interventions, force-based manipulations, yoga, those would be different classes of interventions. I'll call them kinds for the purpose of our talk. So within kinds of treatment approaches, the bona fide treatments show comparable outcomes despite huge avowed differences. So in our studies and others, CBT equals MBSR equals ACT equals behavior therapy in primary outcomes. It's just the way it is. This also extends to work in psychopathology, where we have different treatments for PTSD, all coming up with the same outcomes. FBMs and variants, I got this from an article by Bielowski. There seems to be the same kind of common outcomes, despite the fact that there might be different variants. Now, across kinds of studies, such as across CBT and physical exercise, there does seem to be some kind of equivalence as well. So, and of note, in all the effect sizes across all things we're talking about, there doesn't seem to be anything more than modest. This is kind of an alarm bell, and we'll talk about it later. So, if we look at all the repeated findings from outcomes, from effect sizes that are similar, and equivalence of outcomes compared to each other, we could conclude, and do so with some sort of complacency, that we have many bona fide treatments and they're all viable. Providers and patients have many options, and that's good. Variety is good. We should continue developing new treatments, follow along this pathway, despite the fact that there is no evidence for superiority. After all, there might just be a ceiling effect for non-medical treatments on average. That is to say, we reached it with what we're doing, and that's that. We should just be happy with the fact that we have a variety. And the way science could help this method was to see whether or not we can match people to the best treatment. So to try to increase the average effect by finding people respond best to this or to that. This uniformity, though, could make us wonder and become a little bit uneasy and curious. So despite different theories and widely divergent techniques, treatments get to the same place at the same time. Why? The ubiquity of common effects suggests that these ostensibly different treatments, characterized by wildly different mechanisms, wildly different techniques, have many common attributes that we're missing. So these considerations lead us to think about mechanisms. How does it work? So let's take a quick step back and think about typical treatment evaluation and development. And it usually goes, and this is very simplistic, usually goes from theory, proposed mechanisms, techniques that activate those mechanisms, and outcomes. So for instance, CBT, oh, by the way, this will be heavy psychosocial because that's what I do, sorry. CBT, the mechanism proposed by CBT would be changing pain-related cognitions because those underlie emotions and behavior. Cognitive restructuring would be one of the techniques to enact that, and that would lead to better symptoms. This typical research follows this path and logic, however. Since we did cognitive restructuring based on CBT theory, you look at this, we see that the treatment group did in fact get better. Cognitive restructuring must have caused the post-treatment differences between the two conditions by changing those cognitions. This is what we seem to want to assume and know. After all, we're tired, the patients are tired, and therefore CBT theory is supported. Take a step back and we look at the bottom here. I think my cursor works. Typical outcome research really only examines this. We have CBT here, giving CBT leads to better outcomes. What we don't know is we have no idea whether cognitive restructuring had anything to do with those outcomes, whether cognitive restructuring had anything to do with changing the pain-related cognitions or the mechanism. Cognitive restructuring may not have activated the mechanism at all. Changing pain-related cognition, that might not have had anything to do with outcomes. We don't know given these methods. Now, if we want to answer how does it work and study those mechanisms and figure out what's really going on underneath all of this, we have to do better than this tried and true method of comparing treatments to weak control groups and then just looking at pre-post change scores. Before we get into that though, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but maybe not, what is really so important about mechanisms? Well, this is where I get in my soapbox. It's about 20 feet tall at this time. So I'm balancing. What empirically supported knowledge of how does it work get us? Without it, what don't we get? We cannot tell whether treatments work for reasons specified by theory. So we got a whole bunch of made up stuff and we don't know if it's actually true. We can't discriminate effective elements of treatment from redundant and inert elements. So we think this is what really makes things work, but we don't know what's inert and we can't tell the difference. We do not have theoretical empirical principles by which to enhance techniques. So this might work great, but we don't know. Is there any way to actually enhance it? We don't know because we don't even know what this is. We cannot specify what exactly must be preserved in treatments as we move from well-controlled RCTs to real-world clinical practice settings. So we move our CBT to the effectiveness trials with chronic pain patients, and we may, out of convenience, leave some of the key stuff behind. We don't know that it was key. Now, and beyond scientific rigor, we simply do not have empirically supported rationale for asking people with pain to engage in the therapeutic techniques that cause so much time and effort on our part, on their part. We don't know whether or not those techniques actually lead to the outcomes we hope they do. Seems to work, but we're not sure why. It's simply not good enough. However, this is going to be a lot of hard work. The devil is in the details. So before we get rolling on any of these things, we're going to have to define our mechanisms and the techniques that activate them. We're going to have measures. We need measures of mechanisms, and that could be at all kinds of levels. Self-report, brain scanning, could be bloodborne measures, physical measures, we need rules of evidence for supporting a mechanistic role. We actually have to have a courtroom to decide whether or not there's enough evidence for this being a mechanism, and there have to be rules. And finally, we have to design studies and have statistical methods that are geared toward unearthing mechanisms. CBT is an example. Theory, interpretations and beliefs about events underlie emotional behavior responses. So change in interpretations and beliefs, and you change emotional behavior responses. So the mechanism would be to change those pain-related cognitions. Technique, one of the many, would be cognitive restructuring. Measure of mechanism, one very popular one would be pain catastrophizing. There are many other self-report measures of cognitive pain-related cognitions that we could use. Pain catastrophizing seems to have risen to the top in recent research. So the default option when informing our work about how treatments might work is what's called the specific mechanism model. And when you really think about it, we really want to prove that there are specific mechanisms, because that's going to be able to tell us that what we do actually leads to outcomes. We have a lot of stake in what we do. We like the fact that what we do is actually the thing that makes things work, makes things work. So all chronic pain patients may get to the same place. By the way, that's still a controversial statement, but I stand by it. But do so via their own theoretically specified and distinct therapeutic mechanisms. So get to the same place, but something like this. So behavior therapy gets here via this, cognitive therapy gets here via this. In other words, all of these are a one-to-one correspondence depending on the specific mechanism proposed by the theory. Now, these rules of evidence I alluded to are quite something, and they're quite daunting. So if you really sit down and think, what do we really need to know to say that a mechanism is specific? These are at least the 5 things we'd want to know. Substantial change in mechanism precedes change in outcome, so that cause precedes effect. Early change in mechanism predicts later change in outcome. Cause predicts effect, but not effect predicting cause. Change in mechanism is specific to the treatment approach. So we work really hard in CBT to do cognitive restructuring to change pain catastrophizing. So we want it to be really big in CBT, but not so big in MBSR, and not so big in yoga, exercise, or Tai Chi, despite findings. Mechanism change has some degree of unique relationship, so we want our pain catastrophizing to account for a large share of the outcome variance, and then maybe some of the other ones like working alliance and patient expectations. Sure, they can come along for the ride, but they're going to play second fiddle. And a new one, and we won't have time to talk about this today, timing and mechanism change that corresponds to the application of techniques. Okay. Now, design and stats of a typical study. Target treatment is compared to minimal control. We saw that in the figure a minute ago. Pre to post follow-up assessment only. Specific mechanisms typically the only specific mechanism, very few mechanisms are measured, and these tend to be post hoc because the study was designed to evaluate efficacy. And then analyses are focused around pre-post change curves. And then we know pre-post change curves mean you can't tell causation. All you can tell is correlation. The typical outcome study design is simply not sufficient to address the rules of evidence for establishing specific mechanism status. It's not enough. We've got to go the distance. And this is the distance. First of all, we have to, and this is what ForceNET is talking about, design studies to test mechanisms. So instead of thinking we'll do an outcome study and then we'll have mechanisms along the ride, no. The focus is on testing mechanisms. We want to compare multiple active treatments. We can throw in a control group, but we don't want to do control to active treatment. We want multiple active treatments so that we can evaluate multiple mechanisms. We need frequent, minimum each session assessments. If we can do daily diary for 8 weeks, that would be even better. But each session ain't bad. Multiple specific and non-specific mechanisms, and hopefully multi-method assessment. Big difficulty with some of my research is that we're completely dependent on self-report. We'd like to add actigraphy, lab-based measures of people moving around, things like that. Some kind of multi-method assessment. Lagged and cross-lagged analyses over session-by-session epochs. This is critical. We have to be able to have things predicting time 1, predicting time 2. Analyses to test unique and common effects. And then, as I mentioned before, the timing and or rate of changes. A whole other topic. This kind of statistical analysis would have to be key center to all the statistical analyses that would be in this kind of a trial. Here, we're looking at a lagged analysis, actually a cross-lagged analysis. The prior mechanism change predicting later mechanism change. So session 1 predicting session 2, and you can average this across all the sessions with HLM. The other relationship that's critically important as well to specific mechanism is that prior outcome change does not predict later mechanism change. As it turns out, that's not the case because specific mechanism model really isn't going to hold water. Still, no matter what kind of a mechanisms we're after, this is a key aspect of analyses, looking at these lagged analyses. So far, how much support do we have regarding the existence of specific mechanism models in non-medical treatments? Given these 5 rules of evidence, 6 now, I would go with very little, and that's being generous. Accumulating results from studies with varied designs and statistic features, we have tons of evidence that pre-post changes in mechanism and outcome correlate, okay? But those are actually zero correlations. There's no causal precedence there. In some recent work, putative mechanisms are similarly related across different treatments. So pain catastrophizing changes the same in CBT, MBSR, behavior therapy, okay? There's no evidence there that CBT targets pain catastrophizing. Actually, the same with pain self-efficacy. It's all a big family affair. Lagged analyses show that prior mechanism changes predict later outcome changes. That's good. We got some lagged effects, but also vice versa. So time 1 pain intensity predicts time 2 pain catastrophizing. So instead of a lag like this, it's more like a spiral. A good spiral because everybody's moving up, because everybody gets better. So we have a spiral, which is going to really complicate our measures of mechanism, at least for the kinds of stuff I do with psychosocial stuff. The lagged effects are not specific to any one treatment. Again, this is just a big family affair. Mindfulness predicts pain intensity changes in CBT just as well as it does in mindfulness. And the timing of mechanisms and outcome changes are not consistent with when the therapeutic techniques are applied. Again, another topic. So there is no consistent evidence for specific mechanisms, at least in the psychosocial stuff that I do. I mean, none. But there is evidence that changes in pain-related cognition may act as a mechanism shared across different treatments. So pain catastrophizing seems to be somebody that's everybody's favorite. You change pain catastrophizing in some way, you're going to have a salutary effect on outcomes. And from the literature, CBT, MBSR, BT, pain education, exercise, and yoga all have significant effects on pain catastrophizing and all show mediation effects of pain catastrophizing on outcomes. And what's critical here is that some use cognitive restructuring techniques. MBSR might even be considered using a cognitive restructuring technique. Some do not. Exercise, yoga, nope. So there's some common element of these treatments that causes cognitive change. Pain catastrophizing changes despite the fact that there's no deliberate cognitive restructuring techniques. So they may not be necessary. There's something else going on that's changing this mechanism that accounts for outcomes across wildly different treatments. What? So given the similarity of effects on outcomes, we might be proposing a more parsimonious model called the shared mechanism. Many chronic pain treatments get to the same place, because of changes in core critical mechanisms that are shared across ostensibly different approaches. So it'd be something like this. So behavior therapy gets here by activating all of these. Cognitive therapy, similarly, by activating all 4 of these, gets to here. So all of these might be common mechanisms underlying us. Right. So if these theoretical distinctions and elegance, they may just be the tip of a treatment iceberg, okay? Because what's underneath it are these common mechanisms. So this theoretical distinctions, all those niceties, all the time we spend, all the things we spend a lot of time on elaborating and testing, the true core mechanisms shared by all treatments are the 90% of the iceberg lying underneath all of this. Now, I'm not advocating abandoning the search for specific mechanisms, which is the tip. I'm asking that we widen our consideration of the mechanisms that may be operating during any given treatment base, or during any given treatment approach, the stuff that's the base, okay? So we might be after the, how FBM might be able to reduce muscle spasm as a specific mechanism, but FBM might be working through so many other mechanisms. We have to find out what they are. And might these other mechanisms be the chief producers of outcomes for SBM? It might not be the theoretically driven specific mechanism at all. Muscle spasm, reducing muscle spasm might be an important contribution of FBM, but it might be that behavioral activation, just being, do some maneuvers, that person says, I can get off the couch and walk around today. Outside of treatment, that might be engaging in behavioral activation, which is actually the true mechanism for FBM, getting people off the couch, outside. I don't know. I'm just saying we have to consider that possibility. Here are some potential groups of shared mechanisms: psychosocial ones, physiological. When I say physiologically, I'm really talking about aerobic capacity, strength, flexibility, endogenous pain modulation, endogenous opioids, endogenous cannabinoids, and the therapeutic effects, working alliance and expectations. Here's an example of what I mean by this. We should not assume that CBT works via psychosocial mechanisms. It's a good bet, okay? And research says that it's at least one of the mechanisms by which it works. But we should also examine the extent to which, say, something like behavioral activation, also a part of CBT, activates physiological and endogenous pain modulation mechanisms. It might be that CBT works because it increases aerobic capacity, which in turn affects endogenous opioid function. Okay? Pain catastrophizing might just be a marker, an epiphenomenon of real mechanisms underlying it. We just don't know. Step 1. Within different treatment approaches, we would want to compare different extant treatments. So we would take state-of-the-art methods and statistical techniques to uncover mechanisms and treatments we already have. Okay, and this is a study that we did. It's in Press and Pain. Actually, the mechanism paper is going to be out in JCCP. We just got that heading toward production. If anybody wants free copies, I can send them to you. Here we compared CT, mindfulness, and behavior therapy to treatment as usual. We assumed that they would all be the same. That was an assumption. That was actually our specific aims. Equivalence. Well, we're interested in lagged, cross-lagged effects, magnitude of unique and shared effects of different mechanisms, the role of non-specific factors such as therapeutic alliance and expectations, and we're interested in the timing of mechanisms and outcome changes. Step 2 is really what I was hoping to really bring out today, and that instead of comparing like treatments, but to compare distinct different kinds of treatments. We have an ongoing trial with Joel Bielowski and Greg Kotchak as part of it, where we're comparing mindfulness treatment to spinal manipulation therapy. I assume, that they're going to produce similar magnitude outcomes. But the chief focus is to test whether mindfulness is the chief mechanism in MT, spinal stiffness is the chief mechanism in SMT. Again, we're not giving up on specific mechanisms. Degree to which both treatments alter and rely on changes in endogenous pain modulation, and the degree to which both treatments alter and rely on changes in psychosocial factors. In this study, we're examining whether or not SMT works just as well via spinal stiffness changes as it does in changing pain catastrophizing. We're open We're agnostic to the idea that there are specific mechanisms that drive chief effects. It might be that things we are not considering are going to be the chief mechanisms that drive specific treatments. It could be all cognitive changes that SMT works by. We don't know. Change. Step 3 would be identifying potential treatments using the most potent technique, identifying the most potent mechanisms and using the techniques that activate them. So here, again, we're not going to give up on designing and testing new and theoretically distinct treatments. No. This is to augment that and make this more important. From steps 1 and 2, we identify the most potent mechanisms that reduce pain and improve function. We determine and refine the techniques that best activate them. SMT may be the best way to elicit cognitive change. We don't know. The overarching goal is to boost efficacy over the treatments we already have by relentlessly pursuing mechanisms. So instead of spending 90% of our time spiffing up the part of the iceberg we can see, I'm saying let's spend 90% of our time and money understanding and improving the part of the iceberg that carries us everywhere and that we don't see. If we don't see it now, but we're going to see it with future research. We owe it to the field, our patients, and taxpayers to actually increase the effectiveness of our chronic pain treatments. Those modest effect sizes simply won't do. We spend too much time and effort on these things. Let's make them better. Modest? No. How about strong? And we need serious focus on mechanisms to actually make these changes. Step 4, moderators. But that's a whole nother topic. I'm not going to bring that up today. And that's it. Please, let's think outside the box. And that's all I have to say. Well, today.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Burns. That was very aspirational and very clinically relevant. What we're going to do now, folks, is we'll use the chat function. We'll open it up for questions for both Dr. Tuttle and Dr. Burns. For time's sake, we'll dedicate about 5 minutes to this because we do have 2 more speakers. I do notice we have a question already for Dr. Burns. What other mechanisms do you think musculoskeletal pain research should consider?
Boy, I come from the psychosocial background, so I move toward that, particularly one that I consider the most general of all, and that we're telling people a whole new story about their pain. Your spinal manipulation therapist comes in and says, this is what's causing your pain, right? So you have a whole new way of looking at things. Most people come into treatment and they go, I'm a mess. It's completely unpredictable. I don't know what's going on. We give them a notion. So that would be one mechanism. It would be tough to study. I know that people are invested in looking at fMRI changes. I don't know enough about that to say how those can be mechanisms. I'm not saying they can't be. I don't know enough to comment on it, other than to say the best fMRI study hasn't been done yet, and that's where we do repeated measures lagged associations. So it would be great to see that a SMT changed some brain function, and then that brain function then changed pain. What I would also like to see is I'd like to see whether or not a brain function preceded changes in pain, rather than we have to worry about, we have to rely on people reporting pain at the same time that they're getting their fMRI. A lagged association study using fMRI, that would be cool. Tons of other mechanisms. The other kinds of tests we have in clinic, such as sit to stand, walking tests, all of those could be used as mechanisms as well. But those would be located probably in the physiological ones. I could probably go on and on. I don't think there's an end to the number of things, because we're talking about people interacting with other people and giving them new knowledge. Who knows what's actually doing? We have to start.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. Dr. Tuttle, do you have any thoughts with respect to NIH's view on which type of mechanisms that might be possibilities with to study in addition?
Yeah, so John's talk struck me as very interesting, because I think we're trying to work towards understanding the bottom part of the iceberg with these U24 networks, right? So we're encouraging these collaborations, not just among clinicians and scientists, but scientists who may be studying different phenomena, or as I guess as John would say, maybe epiphenomena, that they're all, working towards the same common mechanisms. Maybe they're just looking at their own, favorite intervention. But I think that's one of the interesting things about these networks is we can encourage these sorts of conversations moving forward. So I would say that, NCCH doesn't pick favorites on one intervention or another. I think that, we're very goal focused on reducing pain and increasing, efficacy from those modest effect sizes to large effect sizes. So we're not going to pick winners here. We encourage, these sorts of conversations and maybe looking at commonalities between different interventions is what I would say.
Thank you for that. And another question, I think, for Dr. Burns, what are your thoughts about combining interventions to amplify mechanisms to see greater improvements? Any thoughts on that?
Sounds like a great point. First thing we do is have to figure out what the mechanisms are. So we can assume that mindfulness works via mindfulness, add that to cognitive behavioral therapy, and that, of course, as we think we know, works on changing cognitions. We don't know that, though. So the first thing to do is to figure out what the mechanisms are and then combine those, and not to think in terms of treatments, because treatments are just representations. They're the top of the iceberg and the mechanisms are below it. So yes, combining mechanisms, absolutely.
Dr. Burns, I've heard you speak before, and you didn't get a chance to talk about moderators or mediators, but you did mention the timing of the testing. Can you just touch on that just a bit more about how you want to make sure that the measurement of the mechanisms fall within the clinical outcomes and
Right.
not just after or just before?
It's my point was a little different. It was actually revealing, again, the lack of evidence for specific mechanisms. So for instance, in a trial I was involved in, cognitive restructuring began in the second half of treatment. Well over 50% of the cognitive changes occurred in the first half of treatment before the cognitive restructuring actually began. So the timing of the technique application was inconsistent with the theory that cognitive changes would occur with that technique. Okay? Something else changed the cognitions early in treatment, not the technique that is designated to do so. Okay? So that's what I meant by timing. The timing is off for a lot of these treatments. That again, some other mechanism is at work, particularly in early treatment, long before people get exposed to all the techniques.
Fantastic. I think we have one more time for one more questions from Dr. Klowicki. How does placebo fit into mechanisms? One could hypothesize that placebo might work through the same mechanisms mentioned in the talk.
Right. I think placebo is an old term, and we want to talk about what is a placebo effect. So 15 years ago, therapeutic alliance and patient expectations were thought of as placebo effects. Now we study them directly. So what other kinds of things are going to make somebody have a generalized effect to having some kind of treatment? Let's figure that out, because pains me to say this, but all of our placebo effects might be the chief mechanisms driving, well, in my work anyway, the psychosocial stuff. Things that were once placebos might be the chief drivers. And that's kind of dismaying, but it might be true. So I don't think of calling things placebo. I think, what is it? So again, therapeutic alliance and patient expectations, formerly placebos, are now factors in and of themselves. Let's keep going with that.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. We're going to go ahead and pause right there and move on to our next couple of speakers. So Dr. Burns, do you mind? I'm going to share my screen now. All right. And our next speaker is actually one of ForceNet's own, Dr. Greg Kowchuk.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Chad, and welcome, everybody. It's just fantastic to have you all here. And when I say all of you, I don't think anyone's mentioned yet that we have over 200 people now as members in ForceNet, and I've been keeping a track on the participants. We've had a high of 83. So I don't think it's lost on us that this is really a first, that this type of researcher interested in force-based mechanisms we don't really have a way of getting together on a regular basis. When we see a slide like this at a conference, usually we see each other at conferences that are defined along lines of professions or the discipline we trained in our PhD, but rarely do we get together as a group. And there are a lot of advantages in that. So you saw earlier in the introductions today, maybe you missed it if you came in late, but the way we think of ForceNet is it's really a community for force-based investigators that happens to have some funds to give away as well. So we're not just about giving out the funds, we want to create your scientific home. And Chad, can I have the next screen? So one of the things we're going to do in training is try not to recreate the wheel with a lot of training opportunities that already exist out there, because training is a great way to create community, just like conferencing, but none of these things are by themselves the way of building a community. So there's lots of grant writing courses out there. You've probably got one in every institution that's represented here. How can we fill some voids for training in our particular discipline that may be helpful? Next one, Chad. So one of the things might be, first of all, just creating a course on what force-based mechanisms look like and how we might explore them in an investigative sense. And that was a great lecture from Dr. Burns. And if some of those concepts that he described there are a little unfamiliar, or maybe you've got new ECRs in your lab or summer students, or you just maybe like to look at this material a bit again to upgrade how it is you're writing your proposal for ForceNet, we're going to put together an overview on mechanistic research on the Articulate platform. It's a corporate training platform that really does a great job of helping get across materials at the user's own pace. And we're going to take community-wide perspectives from the membership about how to do that, and different examples, whether it be molecular or whether it be on clinical levels or contextual levels of what does mechanistic research look like, what are the methods involved, etc. Next slide, Chad. And because there are so many other training opportunities for grant writing, we thought we would maybe fill a void with trying to add to your grant writing or your manuscript writing skills with some of the more recent modern electronic resources that go along with those activities, whether that be materials to help with your writing in real time, your citation management, or how to use the metadata embedded within the citations to ensure that you're really covering everything that's out there with respect to looking at the literature. And we have some ideas for either podcasts or guest lectures that would be recorded in this domain. Next one, please. And of course, you can't talk about these types of AI-driven tools without talking about ChatGPT. And it's beyond today to describe what this is, but there are some tremendous opportunities for us as investigators to leverage this type of technology in our writing, in our creation of manuscripts and grants, and we look forward to presenting some material on this. And then the last slide is an opportunity we have to build what we call a community mentoring network. And I'm fortunate enough to be involved in two of these, one for young investigators interested in chiropractic topics, and one in the bioengineering space here at the University of Alberta. And the idea of this romantic idea of everyone having their mentor, this one-on-one relationship, is wonderful, but it's sometimes hard to attain. So we've found that using a mentoring community or network of people interested in mentoring is really a way to help ECRs and young trainees find the things that they need, which change all the time, and maybe change what they need in terms of the mentoring advice or who gives that advice to them. So we're hoping on building this ForceNet community of mentors as well. And with that, I hope you can see that it's not just about writing the proposals to submit to ForceNet for potential funding. It's really about creating this value add and developing a community for all of us who are interested in force-based mechanisms research. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. we're now going to move to Dr. Bill Reed, who will be talking about our pilot grant opportunities.
Thanks, Greg and Chad. Basically, this information is found up on our website. So I just made a quick synopsis of the key information that you may be wanting to know. The pilot awards, we anticipate funding 2 to 4 per year for the next at least 3 to 4 years. With a awards up to $50,000, there is a indirect institutional cost limitation of 15%. We wanted to direct more funds to the research, and so we put a cap on the indirect cost. There are 2 annual submission cycles. We are requesting a letter of intent just so we can line up reviewers for the applications. So the letters of intent deadlines are March and September 1st, whereas the applications are due May and October 1st. You will submit your applications through the website. If you go to the website, there'll be a submit button that you can submit once you have either your LOI or your application completed. Now, as the focus of this talk and today, this presentation, the applications must be mechanistic oriented and not patient-centered outcomes. And so whether it's massage, touch, manipulation, mobilization, it has to involve 2 things. It has to be a force-based manipulation, which is a broad base, and you can find more on the RFA of what that contains, but force-based manipulations, and it must be mechanistic oriented. There were 5 priority areas for this initiative, this U24 initiative. ForceNET picked 3 of them, including the biomechanical component or the metric development of biomechanical measures forces put to the body. And then we have the neuromechanosensory transduction component. And these are more physiological mechanisms that are involved with force-based manipulations. And then we have, as spoken about today, the psychosocial or contextual mechanisms. And so those are the 3 of the 5 high priority items identified by NIH in this area of force-based mechanisms that we are, as ForceNet, are focusing in on. Now, as I mentioned here, primary outcomes now cannot be patient-centered outcomes. Can they be included? Yes, they can be included, but they can't be your primary outcome measure. The PIs of these applications need to be in the United States or in an institution in the United States, but co-investigators can be international. And there's more information on the RFA regarding that. So we encourage collaborations between different institutions. And this is one way, but your PIs must be, since it's federal funds, the PIs must be from institutions within the United States. You can submit 1 pilot application to 1 force-based mechanisms network. There are 3 of the different mechanisms funded by this U24 mechanisms. ForceNet is one of them. So we encourage you to look at ForceNet and the other 2 networks as well, and see which one best fits your area of interest, and then apply to one of the force-based networks. If IRB and ICOOK approval will be required, the overall duration is 1 year. We do anticipate, as outlined in the RFA, a publication, and then which will lead to a submission of a larger grant, as outlined in the RFA itself. So that's just a quick snapshot in one slide of what the opportunities are. There again, we hope to fund 2 to 4 per year for the next several years, and look forward to receiving your applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And for those who see the chat, Ben Tupper has actually placed the link for the RFA for those who want to directly access that. We do have a couple of minutes available. If anybody has a direct question in the chat they'd like to ask either Greg or Bill about our training initiatives or the pilot grants. And I will be providing contact information at the end of this presentation if you'd rather contact us directly. All right, well, seeing none, I will go ahead and go to the summary slides and we'll finish up for the day. First of all, I want to thank everybody for attending. We had a great turnout. We really appreciate the fact that you are interested in the ForceNet initiatives, and we'd love to share these initiatives with you moving forward. We have a number of work team members that I would like to thank, and they're listed on the slide in front of you. I'd also like to thank those that are employed by ForceNet, Jen Bent, Sarah Bruton, and Ben Tupper, who have been instrumental in helping us move this forward. We do have a number of new initiatives that will be coming up in 2023 that I'll briefly go over with you. We will be publishing a special issue in the Journal of Manual and Manipulative Therapy in either the July or September issues on mechanisms-based research, and we hope to have 8 or 9 papers on this topic. We hope to have a second webinar on mechanisms research, similar to this one, with a slightly longer keynote. We don't have to pack everything in, probably in the late summer of 2023. We also will be publishing a paper soon. We've created a harmonized definition of contextual factors for clinicians and researchers. As you likely know, it's all over the place within the literature. We hope that the first of several training initiatives and opportunities will drop probably in the fall of 2023. And as Bill outlined, there will be a second RFA that will be dropped in the fall also of 2023. And I do see the chat is populating, and I'll see if there are some questions. There's a question from Dr. Benechek. If one of the pilot mechanisms involves psychosocial contextual factors, can you please provide an example of a primary outcome that might be of interest and relevant? Bill, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to tackle it?
You can tackle, that's more your area.
You got it. So, Jason, what we're looking for is changing the contextual environment, but having a mechanism as the primary outcome. So if fMRI is your primary outcome, or if a blood draw is your primary outcome, then maybe changing that contextual environment, or changing the looking at the effects of a force-based manipulation on individuals with different psychosocial components. But the mechanism has to be the primary outcome. And I hope that explains it. And then from Eric Jacobson, Bill, can designs for psychosocial also include measures of psychological mechanisms and consequence, or concurrent with social touch?
Yes, I do think that there's room for that with that. And someone else asked, how you define mechanisms. There's 2 things on the website with that. There's some short videos that will help explain or better explain what we mean by mechanisms and what we're looking for. That should be a benefit to look at. But yes, I mean, basically, they'll provide, we hope to have a few examples on the website here real shortly to give a better idea, because we recognize mechanisms means different things to different investigators, and therefore hopefully that will answer your questions here if it's not already answered on the material that's posted on the website, because there's several short videos, there's several documents that should help explain and define the contextual factors component.
And also, folks, I think it's important that you know that we're very open, that if you want to pitch your idea to us to see if it fits within the parameters of the pilot grants, we're happy to walk it through with you. Both Bill and my email address is here, and we do answer all the emails that we get. It may save you a lot of effort, and we again would love to talk to you about this. I just want to make sure there's nothing additional in the chat. No more questions. I'm going to go ahead and call our kickoff meeting. We're ecstatic with our presentations by Dr. Tuttle and Dr. Burns, and we really appreciate the interest and the number of individuals that agreed to sit in on this. We hope to hear from you in the future, and please keep us in mind if you're interested in pilot grants. Thank you, everyone.